As archives are starting to open after the Cold War, it becomes more and more obvious that there has been much more dialogue in conflict situations than many people would have thought, also during the Cold War. There is this notion on the part of many that the Cold War and moving towards the end of the Cold War essentially was a matter of capabilities. Military capabilities above all. The Soviet Union simply could not afford to continue investing so much into the military as it did in response to the enormous American and Western investments. But of course, in many cases, capabilities cancelled out each other and led to insecurity on higher levels of armaments, as illustrated by the military balance between Israel and the Arab states, or the military balance between Iraq and Iran. What one forgets, using just the capability prism, is that international relations contain many interrelated processes, and that in the end the posture of actors is based on perceptions, both visions and fears. Such perceptions are not just influenced by objective facts such as capabilities, but also projections into the future, different perceptions about what happened in the past. So when discussing dialogue in conflict situations, it may be particularly important to take a helicopter perspective, which, looking back from the helicopter, needs to factor in that the notion that the world came out of the Cold War without dialogue is false. Already dialogue initiated by President Nixon and Henry Kissinger with the Soviet Union and with China on Vietnam and the Middle East illustrates that dialogue is not only for peacetime conditions, where there are no significant problems, or not even as any real confidence between parties. And one has to remember that in this period as well, certainly there was no lack of propaganda or disinformation. The period of the Cultural Revolution in China essentially meant that the Chinese view was there were only a few countries in the world that could be described in a positive way. The Soviet Union and China both encouraged by quite a number of different acts, and the US on its side as well, of course, covert activities, arming different insurgents over decades, which one would have thought would make dialogue impossible. But dialogue was not defined as a sign of weakness, but as a sign of strength. So my main point here is that many of the lessons from that period in how Europe and the world moved from confrontation to cooperation have to be looked at again. And the global strategy discourse may be a useful way to do that, just that. I mention this because there is a debate now about Russia and a number of other international actors, to what extent it is possible to have a meaningful dialogue with Russia. This was, of course, a similar discussion in comparison to that which took place on Iran just a few years back. Representatives of the European Union clearly had a limited scope for dialogue in these kind of situations, and they needed explicit instructions to do what they could do. So one has to remember that once you also close down dialogue communication lanes, then it's maybe very difficult to open them up again. So you need to define the strategic objectives of dialogue. The EU needs to make clear its own posture in relation to the situation at hand. One has to think through what can be done on a formal level, what can be done on informal levels, what issues can be discussed. Here it's useful to remind oneself about the controversial discussion about the scope of dialogue with Iran just before the Iran nuclear agreement, where some argued in favor of staying with the very limited scope of the dialogue, just focusing on the nuclear issues, and others thought it would be good to broaden the dialogue to include the overall Middle Eastern situation. What came out on balance was a well-prepared EU posture, which showed the way perhaps forward. The Arab Spring in turn, or what was later called the Arab Uprising, stressed, on the other hand, the need to keep in touch with civil society, which of course is very difficult in repressive systems. Sometimes this requires going into quite technical endeavors in order to broaden contacts. For instance, the economic environmental dimension in the OSCE had an important role over many years in order to open up channels of communication with societies in many countries in Central Asia, etc. From a limited EU perspective, the reaction to this was often dismissing what one would need the OSCE to do, promoting dialogue on such very complicated topics in the OSCE where it has very limited experience led to skepticism. So here, EU interlocutors specializing on these issues would have benefiting from a wider perspective, looking with a helicopter perspective on other paradigms which could justify such dialogue. So this is something we will have to come back to later, since it's a fundamental issue, illustrates a point that without support and understanding from those in charge of important specialized negotiations on different topics, for instance on energy, it's not likely that one can do effective conflict prevention in many areas of the world. So this is also a case in favor of staff induction, going far beyond the typical addressees of such training when it comes to conflict and crisis. A helicopter perspective on negotiations, looking back to the Cold War, finally should also remind about the importance of procedural negotiations and dialogue. Looking at dialogue superficially, many no doubt would have been and will continue to be extremely frustrated following, for instance, arms control negotiations, where the procedural negotiations have been quite cumbersome. Well, sometimes it's proven that agreeing on procedure can open the gate for substantial solutions as well. And this is not least important when dealing with conflict situations in regions when parties aim for recognition and respect. And again, this is something we will have to come back to, but it gives you at least perhaps a feeling of the very interesting literature which is out there. Of course, when we look back, we often ask ourselves, why did we not do more in terms of dialogue earlier? Here there is a link to strategy, and it's at this point high time to give space for discussion of the second main topic in this course, namely strategy. We will see how the discourse on strategy is pursued by some of the most eminent scholars in this domain in a way which now links up to the literature on cognitive frameworks, the importance of mindset, etc. Strategy has, of course, for a long time been very closely related to game theory, discussing zero-sum solutions, mixed motive games and so on. But now strategies are more frequently analyzed also in terms of perceptions of a less quantifiable science.